Dolls are really creepy. They just are. There's something uncanny about them. Something about that almost, but not quite, totally unlike a real human face of theirs that freaks me out. It's almost as if they've passed on with their wide, unblinking eyes and emotionless expressions. But at least they aren't made from real people. If you ignore where the hair sometimes comes from, and you really should. But what if they were made from real people? This is the story of a brilliant but weird Russian academic and the events that drove him to do something disgusting. Viewer discretion is advised. It was November 2011, and the police in the city of Nizhny Novgorod, Russia, had a tip-off about a guy who was seen hanging about cemeteries a bit more than he should be. They decided to raid his parents' home, where he still lived even though he was 45 years old. They were in there looking for evidence that this man had been robbing graves. They couldn't have imagined where they were going to find it. On bursting in, they didn't find the guy living in the basement covered in Cheetos and playing video games like you might expect. They found a house littered with life-sized dolls. Some sat on shelves, some on a bed, others on the floor. When they took a closer look at the dolls, things got gross. Because they weren't dolls at all. They were his mummies. And no, I don't mean they belonged to his mother. Anatoly Moskvin was a brilliant but odd child. He was born in 1966 and grew up in Gorky in the Soviet Union, a Russian town that's now Nizhny Novgorod. He was really clever, and as there wasn't much for kids to do in Gorky, he and his friends would hang around in the graveyard. They'd do the usual kid stuff, play soccer, light fires to sit around and chat, and generally have a good time. But while his friends went to the cemetery because it was the only good bit of open space around there, Anatoly felt a little too at home. He especially liked freshly dug graves. There was something about the smell of the earth and the sense of what was about to happen the next day. When his friends went home, he'd often spend the night, a disturbed kid, sleeping on disturbed soil. It was a fascination that was about to get much worse. In 1979, when he was just 12, he was spending time by an open grave at the Krasnaya Etna Cemetery, or Red Cemetery, when a procession for an 11-year-old girl called Natasha came by. For a long time in Russia, there's been a tradition of showing respect to the recently deceased by kissing them on the lips. The experience of that tended to differ depending on how big the gap was between the passing and the procession. There are tales of tsars lying in state for weeks who started to, let's say, shed when people gave them a peck where their lips mostly used to be. Thankfully, Natasha wasn't nearly that far gone, and when the party reached Anatoly, Natasha's mother came over a bit weird and hatched a macabre plan. She got some men to drag Anatoly to Natasha's open casket and then told him to give the girl a little peck on the lips. When he refused, to quote Anatoly, an adult pushed my face down to the waxy forehead of the girl in an embroidered cap, and there was nothing I could do but kiss her as ordered. After he was made to kiss her the first time, he chose to kiss her a second time. Then, Natasha's mother took out 2 wedding rings, put one on her daughter's finger and the other on Anatoly's. Anatoly described this strange marriage as magical. Anatoly continued to be a bit of a brainbox while he grew up. By the time he left Moscow State University, he had a degree in philology. By all accounts, he was a stereotypical nerd. He was a bit awkward around other people and he never got up to the kind of things his fellow students did. He never drank, smoked, or partook in the more relaxing and less legal of the chemical stimulants available to most student cohorts, and he was never comfortable around women. While his classmates were losing their virginities as quickly and as often as they could, Anatoly left college having not known a woman biblically, or even casually. But he did know how to speak 13 languages, and he became an expert in linguistics, history, and anything else he could get his hands on. He wrote well-received academic books, translations, articles, and the odd piece of journalism for the local newspaper. He was a talented and fiercely intelligent guy. But none of that was his true passion. What he was really interested in was the occult. After leaving college, he returned home to live with his parents. They were okay with that. They often travelled for months at a time, and knowing the home was being looked after was a good thing, they thought. While they were away, he built up a personal library of more than 60,000 books about occult ritualism, necromancy, magic, and anything else you can think of relating to the dark arts. He loved death and everything about it, and would describe himself, when asked, as a necropolist. He got a second degree in Celtic studies. While studying, he learned that the ancient Druids would sleep on graves to communicate with the spirits within. Whether or not this is true is another thing. We don't know much about the Druids, as the only sources we have are the Romans, who wanted to make them look a bit nuts, or the Irish mythicists, who tried to turn them into superheroes with magic powers. We know they were an elite group that probably did bizarre rituals and had quite a lot of feasting, but that doesn't stop middle-aged men and women from turning up at Stonehenge every solstice in long robes carrying singing bowls and long staffs, who are sure they genuinely really are Freemasons. Druids. Anatoly was the sort who might don a long brown robe. He liked and held on to the magic idea, even if he was clearly not a druid. That would mean becoming Welsh, and that was a step too far. But there was a group a bit like the Druids who lived closer to home in Russia, the Yakuts of Siberia. When Anatoly found out they did a similar thing, he must have wondered if he had Yakut blood in his veins. Maybe that's why he was drawn to sleeping on graves. Perhaps they could hear him and wanted to communicate. He started to scour the obituary section in his local newspapers for children who had recently passed on. When he found one, he'd turn up at their grave and take a nap on it, hoping to get in touch. Sometimes he'd leave little notes on them that the families would find. He signed them Dobry Angel, or Kind Angel. He first wanted to find out who was trying to communicate. Was it some evil force or the spirits of the deceased? He decided it must be the kind spirits of the departed because of reasons, and he had to find a way to talk to them properly. That was when he started to collect the life-size dolls. His parents thought they might be collecting them because he couldn't have children. Well, he could, there was nothing physically wrong with him. But he didn't want to do it in the traditional way, because that would mean doing something terrifying like getting to know a woman. In 2003, he tried to adopt a child from an orphanage, but neither the authorities nor his parents thought it was a good idea. I can't imagine why. In the ensuing argument with his mum, Anatoly said he was going to use black magic to contact the souls of lost kids, then raise them and mummify their bodies to live with him. She didn't take it seriously. She thought these dolls were his way of pretending he was doing that. She didn't realise he wasn't pretending all that much. On May the 9th of the same year, he raised his first spirit, or rather, he robbed his first grave. He walked around the same cemetery where he'd undergone the strange marriage as a child, and found the grave of a girl he thought no one would spot. Then he used a chisel to dig way down and prized a hole in the top of the lid. He yanked the body out. The young girl wore a white top, black skirt, some tights and black shoes, and had very long hair. But the rest, well, that wasn't how he imagined. It wasn't like Natasha's perfectly presented body. This time, there were maggots. There was decomposition. There was horror. He had of course told his mum he was going to mummify the girl before using magic to bring her back. But he realised he had no idea how to mummify someone. So he reburied her in a shallow grave in an abandoned corner of the cemetery and started researching mummification. He worked out that he could use salt and baking soda, pouring it into the girl to dry her out. That also helped eliminate any parasites that might linger and get rid of most of the smell. Then, once he'd done that, he wrapped her in cellophane and buried her again. He went back every week to add more salt and baking soda until July the 25th, when he went over with some clothes to dress her and take her home. Once the body was home, he started to turn it into the first of his new dolls. He stuffed the girl with rags, newspapers, soap to reduce the smell a bit more, and feminine pads to absorb any moisture that was still there. Then sewed her up. Then he made a new face using wax and covered it with nail polish to harden it. Then he applied lipstick and makeup. Then he dressed her. For the rest of 2003, that doll slept in the same bed as Anatoly, though not like that. His relationships with the mummified spirits of the dead were, thankfully, purely platonic. In 2005, Anatoly got a dream job. He was commissioned to travel to each of the 752 cemeteries in the regions near where he lived and catalogue everyone buried in them. For 3 summers, he left his doll behind and explored the gravestones of the people of the Nizhny Novgorod Oblast. Because there weren't many buses, he got around mostly on foot, walking as much as 18.6 miles, or around 30 kilometres, every single day. Sometimes he'd have to spend the night, finding anywhere he could to lay down. That might be doorways, benches, abandoned barns, or a freshly cut grave. Sometimes he'd run out of water. When he did, he just drank from puddles. In August of the second year he was doing this, 2006, he went to a Tartar cemetery in the village of Tukay. As usual, he spent a long day, and then when night drew around him, he realised there wasn't any way he could find transport home, and it was far too long a walk at that time of night. Worse still, it began to rain, and there wasn't anywhere for him to go. He spotted a small lodge in the cemetery and was relieved to find it wasn't locked. The relief didn't last long though, because the roof was leaking, so it was still getting soaked. But there were a bunch of coffins stacked up inside. Now, most of us, I think, would rather sleep out in the rain, maybe under a tree, but not Anatoly. This was perfect. Not wanting to miss an opportunity, he jumped into one of the caskets, pulled another over the top to shield him from the weather, and had a great night's sleep. It was probably the soft lining. The report he wrote about that night for a local newspaper didn't go down well. Tartars are Muslims, and Muslims really don't like people messing about and being disrespectful in their cemeteries. Ultimately, the outrage got him sacked from his job as a journalist. Instead of letting it go, our Anatoly waited a couple of years and then used the terrorist attack as an excuse to go around painting over the images of deceased Tartars. It was this that first got the police interested in him. By the end of the 3 years of research, Anatoly had all he needed for his project. He was also exhausted. His legs hurt, his hair has turned grey and he'd lost weight. He was also finding it hard to sleep outside. He felt he'd gotten too old to spend the night by anyone's grave, but he still wanted to talk to those on the other side. He also knew, or at least he thought he knew, that the spirits would only communicate with him when it was warm and dry. It turns out that there's nothing a non-corporeal entity hates more than a rainstorm. So he needed a way to get close to them without risking his health and keep them warm. It's lucky, if that's the correct word, which I'm pretty sure it isn't, that he managed to dig up more girls while he'd been out and about. He took them from all over and as far away as Moscow, and not all made it back home to join his collection, but 26 of them did. Not all were made in the same way. Some had buttons for eyes. One wore a mask made from a soft toy. Another was more delicate. He had to use self-tapping screws to attach the head to the body, like a tiny version of Karloff's Frankenstein's monster, but in a cute dress. He even put the dried heart of one girl inside another. And they weren't all young girls. In the end, the Moskvin house was filled with dolls ranging in age from 3 to 29 years old. Fortunately, or unfortunately, if you're Anatoly, the disappearing bodies hadn't gone unnoticed. Despite being careful, Anatoly's name kept coming up during the investigation to both the Muslim desecration and some grave robbing that had been going on around that time. That and the fact his neighbours had complained of a rotting smell coming from the basement didn't help things. His parents must have been nose blind. So, in November 2011, the police raided the house he and his parents shared and found his horrifying collection. He was charged with the desecration of the bodies of the dead and their burial places. At first, he was accused of hate crimes against the Tartars as well, but that was dropped because on May the 25th, 2012, the court received the results of his psychological evaluation. Turns out that the man who exhumed the bodies of 26 women or more so he could speak to their spirits suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, a mental health issue in which bouts of psychosis can cause people to find it hard to discern fantasy from reality. He was sentenced to coercive medical measures and moved to a psychiatric clinic. In a hearing in 2020, he still had no remorse. The kind angel said, "There are no parents in my view. I don't know any of them. Besides, they buried their daughters, and this is where I believe their rights over them finished. So, no, I would not apologise. You abandoned your girls in the cold, and I brought them home and warmed them up." And then he warned them that he would dig them up again wherever they were buried. Anatoly Moskvin is now 57 years old and still in care. If you're interested, and maybe you shouldn't be, there's a petition to get him released. The argument is that he didn't really hurt anyone. That is, if you ignore the feelings of the deceased families, which maybe we shouldn't. Thanks for getting this far. If you liked it, there's a button around here to prove it, and another button so you can see more of these. I think it's called subscribe or something. If you want, check out my Patreon, the link is in the card just above right now, and there you can support my journey into history's gross and horrifying corners in exchange for some perks, early videos, extra videos, live streams, you name it. In the meantime, stay gross. Gross is good.